our values of democracy and rule of law.
Down the speaking time to 1 minute now. The next has the floor, Mr. Picula.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Pushkov, for your remarks. You said that at the beginning of every conflict, weapons first start to flow and then conflict escalates. But in Ukraine, weapons left territory in the first place. I would like to remind you that the Ukrainian nuclear arsenal went to Russia in exchange for an agreement that is supposed to guarantee international borders of the country. I got one question. Do you believe that the Budapest Memorandum signed in 1994 is still alive and mandatory for Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Kalniete.
Mr. Pushkov, I would like to ask you when Russia is going to ratify the Statute of International Criminal Court, which Russia has signed. Or you are enough far-sighted not to do it, being afraid that the day will come and those Russian elite soldiers who are fighting on the territory of Ukraine will be brought to the court for their crimes committed in Ukraine. Thank you.
Mr. Fleckenstein, the floor is yours.
Mr. Pushkov, you spoke about a strategic partnership no longer being in existence. We regret this more than you might think, because it's extremely necessary. But a precondition for this is that we have our confidence kindled. We want to be confident that we can solve any problems we might have with one another. You said it would be a slow process. I think it will be. But we don't want a frozen conflict. We want something to budge. There's one condition in place for this. We've got a lot of mutual concerns. We all want to commit to a truce. You said you were somewhat sceptical, but I'm sure you won't disappoint us.
Herzlichen Dank. Herr Demesmaeker.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nebesmaker.
Meneer Pushkov, welkom en bedankt voor de dialoog. Als ik u...
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for this dialogue. If we were to summarize your input this evening, we could make 2 points. The time is ripe for something new, and war doesn't lead to anything. So my question then is, why are you importing war in this way? You know, this is a hybrid war we're seeing in eastern Ukraine now. Russia has denied involvement, but I have never had an answer to my question from the Russian side. And the question is, where and how are these heavy weapons where from and how are these heavy weapons finding their way into Crimea? So perhaps you can answer that question. And then secondly, when is Nadia Savchenko going to be released? She has been held now, and this is totally in breach of all international law in Moscow. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Brok.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. I think it is an error for us to be putting Russia on trial, which is what we seem to be doing. We need to find a political solution to a strategically important problem. Now, I've been a war correspondent for 30 years, and I've never known a war that has been waged on behalf of a third party. There are internal issues here, whether we like it or not, in eastern Ukraine at the moment. They won 52% of the votes at the elections, and only 20% of people seem to be speaking out against the defense minister's statements recently. But we want to avoid any escalation. So my question is the following. First of all, does Russia understand that the Budapest Protocol is still valid? That's a fundamental issue. Secondly, what kind of solution do you envisage for Crimea and for Donbass? Now, I agree that you should sign up to the ICC convention, but at the same time we should ask this same thing to be put forward for Israel and the United States.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Mr. Pushkov, we're probably divided by a great ideological divide here, although there's a gap between Mr. Brok and myself and other members of the committee too. But I think we should try to harness the positive note in what you said. And you quite reasonably said that we should stop war. And that differs from some of the tones we've been hearing here. I think incendiary comments that we've heard here are more fit for a student classroom and not really for a committee meeting in the European Parliament. Now, we all have to remember, whether we like it or not, is that international relations are really more about geopolitical factors rather than ideological factors or sympathy for certain regimes or and what we're seeing at the moment, this uprising in Russia today, is a truth whether we like it or not. Now, there are political forces here today that want to take the reins of power, and we are hoping for more from Europe. We want to have reasonable respect underpinned by trade and international legality and so on. This is what we want from you, and we also want this from the United States, even though with the United States there isn't proper respect for international law either.
Thank you, Mr. Ryzhkov, for coming here. I have, sir, sorry, misspoke. Mr. Ryzhkov, I thank you for Pushkov, I thank you for coming here. I ask you, will you work relentlessly towards making sure that members of this Parliament will be able to travel to Russia from now on? Number two, do you believe that Russia's action in this conflict is fully compatible with the Paris Charter? And number three, when the Serbian OSCE chair criticized the so-called separatists in the last round of negotiations for not even being willing to discuss a ceasefire on the basis of the Minsk agreement, what is your comment to that?
Thank you.
Hvala lijepa, predsjedavajući. Kolega Brok, gospodin...
Thank you very much, colleague Brok. Mr. Pushkov, thank you very much for coming before this Foreign Affairs Committee today. We've lost the microphone. To freely elect its future direction, and that is the European path. Does that mean that every country, every neighboring country of Russia which chooses the European path can face a similar scenario that we have been witnessing in the last year? What is the position of Russia when it comes to respect for the fundamental issues of international law? And how do you think that in conflict with international law, the annexation of Crimea can be so widely supported in the Russian Duma? Please take into account that your current model of behavior immensely reminds us of the model implemented by Milosevic and Serbia in the 90s, and that is definitely not good for Russia or for its neighbors or for the continent where we will continue to live together in the future. Thank you.
Manikins.
Thank you, Chair. With all my due respect to our guest, I would like to take the floor in Russian. There is translation. Я представляю Латвию.
I represent Latvia, and my country maybe best knows how the thaw or freezing of relations with Russia has an immediate impact on our borders. You said that the European Union is not an enemy of yours, but please tell me, what are the steps that Russia is ready to undertake the day after tomorrow, if tomorrow a miracle happens and all European sanctions against Russia are lifted? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks for not trying to convince us that your troops and arms are not in Ukraine. Second, I demand also, like other colleagues, that your competent structures release Nadia Savchenko immediately. You have no right to keep her. My questions: why has Russia not allowed access of the OSCE in the entire area, including drones, to see what's actually happening? Would you not, as a member of OSCE, trust that the OSCE is an objective organization? Next question: as you refer to ethnicity, ethnic composition of Donetsk and Luhansk, with the same argument you can refer to Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa, or even Kiev with regard to the ethnic composition. So if you come with an ethnic argument, where would you actually stop? Which reassurances can you give us that if a ceasefire comes into existence, your appetite is coming to an end? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Mélenchon, you have the floor, please.
Merci, cher Président.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. And in spite of all the respect that I have for you, Mr. Brok, I don't at all agree with your introduction of Mr. Pushkov. I'd like to thank him for being here, and I don't want him to think that EU political opinion is equal to what we've heard in the room today. In France, there are many political leaders and even our Prime Minister who have said that anti-Russian hysteria lead nowhere. Nobody would wage war against Russia unless he were a fool, nor would he intervene militarily in Ukraine amongst all the nuclear power plants. We all know that that would be a terrible waste of time, never mind the exaggerations we've heard here this evening. I don't think you are the aggressor, even though that hasn't been said here. And you can just have a look at what's happening in the United States to see how locked we are in a Cold War mentality in this room. But anyway, it's been very nice to hear all the different points of view. Now, this weekend there is a discussion between our president and yours, and I'd like to know what your provisions will be in the Parliament to see to it that the agreement that made good progress this weekend will actually go ahead and make sure that and will be properly respected by Ukraine. Can I just say one more thing, Mr. Brok? My compatriots will always be grateful to the role Russia played in releasing our country after the last war. We will never forget the 20 million Russian lives lost in serving our freedom. Thank you.
Mr. Mélenchon, für die Befreiung Frankreichs waren auch die Engländer.
The British and the Americans who just attacked were responsible for the liberation of France. In Normandy, it was the Americans and the Brits who landed.
No, I haven't forgotten that, Chairman. And I certainly haven't forgotten the role played by the Russians, so you shouldn't either.
Stop. Und ich muss Ihnen sagen, Sir.
Well, I have to tell you, sir, that if I had the same opinion as you, I'd really have to start questioning myself on whether I'm completely mistaken. Shophartner has the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais d'abord souligner.
Thank you very much, Chairman. First of all, I'd like to say how amused I have been to hear my colleagues pointing the finger at Russia when it comes to free movement, when they themselves are actually on a list of sanctions and have put an obstacle in the way of the free movement of certain Russian individuals. So it's actually rather amusing to see how many people here just want to teach other people lessons and don't actually apply fundamental freedoms and principles themselves. Then, in 1981, France and Germany wanted to develop a Euro-Siberian gas pipeline, and the United States actually introduced a sanctions regime. France and Germany at the time were involved, but it was they resisted, and we had the Cold War underway, but then the United States had to give way and get rid of their sanctions. Now the Cold War is behind us, but we're less independent of the United States today than we were in the past, and I'd like you to think about that. Why is this the case? Why are we having to bow to the United States? I can give you the answer to this question, Chairman. Now I'm responding to the aggression from Mr. Preda and the eastern countries, actually. That's the answer.
1 minute each. And I think that's the difference, that in this parliament everyone can speak. And I hear how the majority in this house were in the resolution, and how many people spoke who did not belong to that majority of this resolution. Then we are a real liberal house that you get a floor for that, and that you should appreciate. The floor has Mrs. Gomez.
Welcome, Mr. Pushkov. I'd like to ask you, why doesn't Russia assume it is a party in this war? And then you recognize that Donbass is part of Ukraine. Is it extendable to Mariupol? I'd like to hear you as well on Crimea. The question has been asked. And finally, you said that you need guarantees for the Minsk agreement to work. What guarantees do you need?
Mr. Hachigorgio.
Καλωσορίζω και εγώ τον κύριο Πουσκόφ εδώ.
Well, I'd like to welcome Mr. Pushkov. We're very concerned by the climate of Cold War that we're seeing growing again in Europe, as if we hadn't learnt anything from the wars and the millions of fatalities. And in fact, within your committees, you've seen an example of this. Now, we don't think that the sanctions have yielded fruit, and we do not agree with the US delivering weapons to Ukraine because it's going to mean more bloodshed. Nothing more than that. I think the reference to Vietnam was quite right. In actual fact, we have to avoid having another Vietnam just outside Europe. Now, what are the sanctions that the chair referred to? Now, you referred to a federation. Do you include Crimea in that?
Благодаря много, господин председател. Хубаво е, че сте тук, господин Пушков.
Thank you, President. Thank you for coming here, Mr. Pushkov. We have always believed we should have good cooperation with Russia in order to solve the challenges of the 21st century, terrorism, fundamentalism, and so on and so forth. Energy, economy, climate change. Unfortunately, in order to have cooperation, two sides are needed. We sincerely hope that Russia will stick to international agreements. I have three questions. First of all, does Russia believe it should stick to the memorandum from 1984? Do you believe that there has been agreement between Mr. Bush Sr. and Gorbachev when it comes to accepting new NATO member states? Because sometimes people say that NATO has not fulfilled its commitments in this respect. And thirdly, aren't you afraid that extreme right-wing and left-wing forces flourish in Europe? Thank you.
Mr. Pushkov.
How much time do I have?
10 minutes? 7 minutes. Try 7 minutes.
Alors voilà, j'ai 7 minutes pour répondre à tout ça.
Okay, well, I've got 7 minutes to answer all of these points. So I'll try to start with the most important things, to my mind. I'll answer a number of questions, but obviously I can't answer them all, because 7 minutes... Well, 7 minutes is what I've been told by the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee here in the European Parliament. 7 minutes is all I have. Anyway, the question, when will Russia ratify the ICC convention? That was the question that came through. Well, perhaps when the United States do, or indeed when Ukraine does. Because if you look into this, you can see that Ukraine hasn't ratified. So there are a number of countries that haven't ratified. Russia is not to be singled out on this front. Then, there was a statement about bombings and shelling coming particularly from the Russian side of the border. Well, that's not true. Shelling is coming from the Ukrainian army side. If only the military positions of the insurgents were being bombed, then you could say that there is war. But actually the cities and towns are being shelled. Already 7 or 8 people have been killed in Donetsk now. And that wasn't the insurgent shelling. And there is a lot of evidence to show that this shelling is coming from the Ukrainian army. You're not going to take my figures so seriously, but I can quote at least Human Rights Watch, which I think is an impartial organization. Human Rights Watch has said that the Ukrainian army has been using cluster bombs. They've apparently used them 3 times. Now, was this discussed here in the European Parliament or in other European institutions? This weapon, this type of weapon, is totally illegal, and yet the Ukrainian army is using it. Ballistic missiles have also been used by the Ukrainians. That has actually been recognized by the United States. So there is evidence. And when I said that things aren't quite as simple as they seem, it's precisely this kind of detail I want you to take on board. When it comes to Crimea, this keeps coming back, this point. And let me just say once again, I'm not going to quote Russian sources here because there are others, but there is an opinion poll organized by Gallup Incorporated, which is an American organization. This was between the 21st and 29th of April. 83% of respondents said that the referendum in Crimea did reflect public opinion in Crimea amongst the residents there. Then, on the 8th of May, the Pew Research Center produced figures. This is another American organization. 91% of respondents said that the referendum was free and fair. So, you know, if you've got questions on this, why don't you go to Pew Research? I didn't make these figures up. Then, in addition, between the 16th and 22nd of January, the GFK group, which is a German group, was responsible for a study carried out in Crimea, and that showed that 93% of inhabitants in Crimea supported unification with Russia. So these are figures that have come from Western surveys. We weren't responsible for these figures, so there must be a problem here, mustn't there? Even if you don't like to hear these things, they're facts. And you've got to look at them head on. If you just want to look at yourselves in the mirror, then that's your problem, isn't it? But the reflection is something that you've got to take more seriously, I think. Then there were other questions as well. Questions regarding neighbouring countries. Russia's neighbours. Should these countries be afraid of Russia? That was the question. Well, in my opinion, and I'm sure this will be confirmed at all levels, in my opinion there is no threat for the countries on Russia's borders. There's no threat whatsoever. There's nothing to worry about. No threat at all. Armenia. Well, that's absurd what you're saying. That's absolutely absurd. Think about the question a little bit. Come to Moscow and we'll talk about it if you like.
No, you will have the visa.